of Dickens's life goes with the throb of that nocturnal gallop. All its real wildness shot through with an imaginative wickedness he afterwards uttered in the drive of Jonas Chuzzlewit through the storm. All this time, and indeed from a time of which no measure can be taken, the creative part of his mind had been in a stir, or even a fever. While still a small boy, he had written for his own amusement some sketches of queer people he had met, notably one of his uncle's barber, whose principal hobby was pointing out what Napoleon ought to have done in the matter of military tactics. He had a notebook full of such sketches. He had sketches not only of persons but of places, which were to him almost more personal than persons. In the December of 1833 he published one of these fragments in the Old Monthly Magazine. This was followed by 9 others in the same paper, and when the paper, which was a romantically radical venture, run by a veteran soldier of Bolivar, itself collapsed, Dickens continued the series in the Evening Chronicle, an offshoot of the morning paper of the same name. These were the pieces afterwards published and known as the Sketches by Boz, and with them Dickens enters literature. He also enters upon many things about this time. He enters manhood, and among other things marriage. A friend of his on the Chronicle, George Hogarth, had several daughters. With all of them Dickens appears to have been on terms of great affection. This sketch is wholly literary, and I do not feel it necessary to do more than touch upon such incidents as his marriage, just as I shall do no more than touch upon the tragedy that ultimately overtook it. But it may be suggested here that the final misfortunes were in some degree due to the circumstances attending the original action. A very young man fighting his way, and excessively poor, with no memories for years past that were not monotonous and mean, and with his strongest and most personal memories quite ignominious and unendurable, was suddenly thrown into the society of a whole family of girls. I think it does not overstate his weakness, and I think it partly constitutes his excuse, to say that he fell in love with the chance of love. As sometimes happens in the undeveloped youth, an abstract femininity simply intoxicated him. In what came afterwards, he was enormously to blame. But I do not think that his was a case of cold division from a woman whom he had once seriously and singly loved. He had been bewildered in a burning haze, I will not say even of first love, but of first flirtations. The whole family stimulated him before he fell in love with one of them, and it continued to stimulate him long after he had quarrelled with her for causes that did not even destroy his affection for her. This view is strikingly supported by all the details of his attitude towards all the other members of the sacred house of Hogarth. One of the sisters remained, of course, his dearest friend till death. Another, who had died, he worshipped like a saint, and he always asked to be buried in her grave. He was married on April 2nd, 1836. Forster remarks that a few days before the announcement of their marriage in the Times, the same paper contained another announcement, that on the 31st would be published the first number of a work called The Posthumous Papers of the Pickwick Club. It is the beginning of his career. The sketches, apart from splendid splashes of humour here and there, are not manifestations of the man of genius. We might almost say that this book is one of the few books by Dickens which would not, standing alone, have made his fame. And yet standing alone it did make his fame. His contemporaries could see a new spirit in it, where we, familiar with the larger fruits of that spirit, can only see a continuation of the prosaic and almost wooden wit of the comic books of that day. But, in any case, we should hardly look in the man's first book for the fullness of his contribution to letters. Youth is almost everything else, but it is hardly ever original. We read of young men bursting on the old world with a new message, but youth and actual experience is the period of imitation, and even of obedience. Subjectively, its emotions may be furious and headlong, but its only external outcome is a furious imitation and a headlong obedience. As we grow older we learn the special thing we have to do. As a man goes on towards the grave he discovers gradually a philosophy he can really call fresh, a style he can really call his own, and as he becomes an older man he becomes a new writer. Ibsen, in his youth, wrote almost classic plays about Vikings. It was in his old age that he began to break windows and throw fireworks. The only fault, it was said, of Browning's first poems was that they had too much beauty of imagery, and too little wealth of thought. The only fault, that is, of Browning's first poems, was that they were not Browning's. In one way, however, the sketches by Boz do stand out very symbolically in the life of Dickens. They constitute in a manner the dedication of him to his especial task, the sympathetic and yet exaggerated painting of the poorer middle class. He was to make men feel that this dull middle class was actually a kind of elf-land. But here again the work is rude and undeveloped, and this is shown in the fact that it is a great deal more exaggerative than it is sympathetic. We are not, of course, concerned with the kind of people who say that they wish that Dickens was more refined. If those people are ever refined, it will be by fire. But there is in this earliest work an element which almost vanished in the later ones, an element which is typical of the middle classes in England, and which is in a more real sense to be called vulgar. I mean that in these little farces there is a trace, in the author as well as in the characters, of that petty sense of social precedence, that hubbub of little unheard-of oligarchies, which is the only serious sin of bourgeoisie of Britain. It may seem pragmatical, for example, to instance such a rowdy farce as the story of Horatio Sparkins, which tells how a tuft-hunting family entertained a rhetorical youth, thinking he was a lord, and found he was a draper's assistant. No doubt they were very snobbish in thinking that a lord must be eloquent, but we cannot help feeling that Dickens is almost equally snobbish in feeling it is so very funny that a draper's assistant should be eloquent. A free man, one would think, would despise the family quite as much if Horatio had been a peer. Here, and here only, there is just a touch of the vulgarity, of the only vulgarity of the world out of which Dickens came. For the only element of lowness that there really is in our populace is exactly that they are full of superiorities and very conscious of class. Shades, imperceptible to the eyes of others, but as hard and haughty as a Brahmin caste, separate one kind of charwoman from another kind of charwoman. Dickens was destined to show with inspired symbolism all the immense virtues of the democracy. He was to show them as the most humorous part of our civilization, which they certainly are. He was to show them as the most promptly and practically compassionate part of our civilization, which they certainly are. The democracy has 100 exuberant good qualities. The democracy has only one outstanding sin. It is not democratic. End of chapter 3.